our history buffs. It's our last class before summer break. And then we have, we're working on programming for this next year's round of programs. We've got some really exciting lectures coming up. So, and if anybody has any special ideas, like any things that you need to learn about, or people who give really great history talks, we're always open to suggestions. So, this month we have our very own Lee Silliman presenting, and so I am going to introduce him. Lee Silliman is a retired secondary level science and mathematics instructor now living in Missoula. As a former resident of the Judith Basin of central Montana, Lee became acquainted with the descendants of these early pioneers. In recent years, he has returned to the high plains to photograph the remnants of this earlier era. Abandoned log and frame houses decaying with every storm, rusting machinery collected into iron piles, rotting horse collars and harness hanging in old barns, childless schoolhouses dotting remote landscapes, and wooden grain elevators scraping the prairie skies, all focal points for Silliman's camera and curiosity. This lecture will paint a vivid portrait of a poignant period in Western history, using photographs, statistics, and first-person narratives. Without further ado, I will hand this over to Lee.
Thank you for coming tonight. Is my microphone coming through okay? You want it to go up, or is it good? It's good. Okay. The library is a popular place. Here we have a movie going on next door and a party down here. I'm glad you're here at this party. It's nice to see a room full of people. I appreciate you coming. We originally were going to have the history of the Moise Bison Range, but the speaker who I had lined up a couple of weeks ago, I contacted him and said, I'm aware that you have you have something going on at the Bison Range. And he says, oh, yes. And we discussed the possibility of him being in two places at the same time, and it doesn't work. And I'm the substitute. I'm on the committee that helps plan these programs. And I was going to be giving this one probably sometime in our next cycle that we're working on. And so I'm the substitute. You get me tonight. And I hope you enjoy it. I've put this together because of my strong interest in this subject, although I'm not technically a homesteader. I've lived among, I've lived among the homesteaders in the Judith Basin in Fergus County from 1969 to 1974, and I've returned in the last 10 years quite a few times to photograph what's left there. So let's jump into a history of the homesteading era on the High Plains. This is a photograph that a friend took of me out in the Missouri River breaks in Fergus County with my big camera that I love to tote around. So here's what we're going to talk about. First, we'll discuss the politics of the Homestead Act, and then how they enticed people to come and file for homesteads on the High Plains. Then we're going to go through a series of photographs of some of their dwellings. Then we're going to briefly discuss the fact that there were actually a number of women homesteaders. Then we're going to look at how mechanization changed how homesteading evolved. And I didn't know this, but there was a considerable amount of, or at least a noticeable amount of fraud in establishment. And then the trials and tribulations. As we all probably know, homesteading was a very tough proposition, and only the tough survived. And then a brief mention of how we honor the homestead people today. So the politics of the Homestead Act. I didn't know this until I started studying this subject in detail. We all think of the homesteading as, the first couple of decades of the 20th century, but the idea was floated way back in the early 1800s. They attempted to get it through Congress, but as you can see, it was thwarted by the slave states. There was almost an even balance in the U.S. Congress in the middle of the 1800s, and the prospect of a lot of states being settled and established would give more votes to the free states than the slave states. So the homestead proposals always got blocked. Another problem with the Homestead Act was that it would draw workers away from the East Coast, where the industrialists liked the idea that there was a surplus of labor where they could keep the wages down and always have enough workers. So that mitigated against having a Homestead Act passed. However, in the midst of the Civil War, the southern states had withdrawn from the US Congress, and therefore the northern states could vote through about anything they wanted. And they voted through the Homestead Act on May 20th. Look at that, May 20th, and today's May 20th. That was 160 years ago today, the Homestead Act. How about that for a coincidence? He signed it, but it didn't go into effect until January 1st of 1863. So it gave people time to understand it. Here's a photograph of the original act. This was common in the 1800s. They actually wrote the acts by hand. I'm very familiar with Yellowstone National Park, and the Yellowstone Founding Act is a 2-page handwritten document also like this. They just had a form, and then they just started filling in with a pen what the act was going to be. Thought that was kind of interesting. What did the Homestead Act provide for? First of all, any person who was the head of the family could file a homestead. And you'll notice it did not say a man there. It could be a woman. And you had to be at least 21 years of age. And you had to make an entry on 160 acres because on the east of the Mississippi, that was plenty enough land to till by one person, with some horses or mules. They later raised it to 320, as we'll see later. Why? You had to live on the claim and farm it for 5 years, later reduced because of the difficulties. You had to cultivate it continuously for those times and build a habitable dwelling and live in it. Can you see where fraud might develop? Were they always there? Did they always live on the land? Did they cultivate it? At the end of the 5 years, you pay a small fee and you would be the owner of the land. And incredibly, by the end of the Civil War, there were actually 15,000 people who had filed homestead claims in the states just across the Mississippi River, Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Montana, and Colorado. So it had a very early start, much earlier than I had anticipated, because most of us think of the Homestead Era, as the early 20th century. So in a sense, the southern states committed a strategic mistake by withdrawing from the Union, because then 3 things got passed which furthered the spread of free labor across the American West. Not only the Homestead Act, but the Pacific Railroad Act was also passed. In the 1850s, there were 4 major Transcontinental Railroad surveys, the northern one, and then 2 in the middle, and then a southern one. Jefferson Davis was the head of the War Department, and the War Department conducted the Pacific Railroad surveys. Guess which route Jefferson Davis thought was going to be the best? The southern route. It didn't go through Congress. But once the Southerners withdrew from the Union, the Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act, which sent it through the central route. And the Morrill Land Grant Act actually gave land from that was under federal jurisdiction to the states to the tune of 30,000 acres for every member of Congress that would allow the states to establish colleges or universities that were dedicated to agriculture and to engineering. And so all of those 3 things, furthered the spread of free labor across the American West. So the Homestead Act was touted as a safety valve because there were a lot of people on the East Coast who were struggling to make a living. Horace Greeley said, if you strike off into the broad free West and make yourself a farm from Uncle Sam's generous domain, we're going to get to the Indian situation here in a minute, you will crowd nobody, starve nobody, neither you nor your children ever need evermore beg for something to do. In other words, this was going to help move people to the west to become agriculturalists, self-supporting, instead of having a large number of urban poor. So I find this an interesting little story. The very first homesteader, he's shown here in this picture. Daniel was at a New Year's Eve party on just before the beginning of the new year in January 1st, 1863. And at the party was a couple of land office officials. This was in Nebraska. And he persuaded them at the stroke of midnight to go over to the land office and let him apply to have a homestead. And the official agreed, and so he became the very first one. And here's his request to be the first one to file for a land. And here is the form that was filled out that gave him that permit to try to homestead. And here's a photograph of his homestead. It's the very first one in the United States, in Nebraska. Okay, you know, when we talk about the federal land, we all know that Native Americans habitated this continent for at least 10,000 years or more. And by the time the Homestead Act was being discussed in the 1850s, already half the land had been taken from Indians by either purchase or otherwise. And if you look at the second picture there, even by when the Homestead Act, there it is. By the time the Homestead Act was going into effect, a lot of the West had been taken from Indians, and even then by 1880 it was almost all gone. And here's today's amount right there. So the Homestead Act was part of the process that dispossessed American Indians from their land. Not entirely so, and I'll get into that. If you look at this chart, you'll see that the Native American land amount dropped precipitously before the major homesteading era. The major homesteading era, the vast majority was from 1910 to 1935. And so most of the land had been taken from Indians prior to the early 20th century massive migration. Now, interestingly, the Homestead Act was valid until 1976, and the last one was given out in Alaska in 1979. So I'm sorry you can't be a homesteader anymore. Now, the Homestead Act, you know, was predicated on the ideas of people who lived east of the Mississippi. And if you are very into Western history, you know, I guess my battery is going out. The 100th meridian was pretty much a demarcation between the lands that had a fair amount of rainfall to the east, and then to the west of that meridian, it became much more dry. And as we're going to see, this led to a number of problems, because the idea of the 160 acres and you know, a man and a few animals, that was much more feasible east of the Mississippi or east of the 100th meridian. You get over here, and we get into much drier conditions, which led to a lot of problems. The person who realized this was John Wesley Powell. He was a Union officer who lost his right arm in the Civil War, and he was very much interested in assisting the settlement of the American West, and he realized that 160 acres or a square plot of land of 320 or 640 acres to a square mile was not practical, because you needed water. You know, the water doesn't come out of the sky very readily in the West compared to east of the 100th meridian. But he could not convince them. So the Homestead Act still gave this idea of you get a square chunk of land and good luck. Hopefully you'll get enough rain or moisture to run it. Well, jumping on board this concept were the railroads. For example, James Hill, president of the Northern Pacific Railroad, they realized that they could make money by getting more people to move along the tracks that they were laying toward the west. And not only the not only the Northern Pacific, but also the Great Northern Railroad. So they got into promoting homesteading big time because they realized this could be a very good profitable situation for them as it would develop. Now I found this map quite interesting. You'll notice it's got the settlement per decade. So prior to most of the settlement east of the 100th meridian, you had it in the green there. But notice the patterns in the next 2 decades. If you know anything about the geography of the American West, you'll know that there's a lot of mountain ranges and there's a lot of important rivers. So a lot of the settlement happened either in the areas near mountains because they wring water out of the sky, or along river valleys. And also, this was still, that area there was still barely had enough moisture coming down as rain and snow. So the areas that we see without those colors tended to be the really dry areas, the areas that did not get homesteaded and that basically reverted to the Bureau of Land Management ownership and management today. Recognizing the difficulty of homesteading on the high plains that are so dry, a man named Hardy Webster Campbell developed the science of trying to dry farm, that is, farming in land that had relatively little precipitation. And he was able to show that it was possible if you left your field fallow every other year, and if you did certain crop rotations and other practices. And so the universities began experimenting with these techniques, including Montana College. And they were having some success, pardon me, because the early 20th century, the decades of 1900 to 1910 and into the teens, were fairly good rainfall years. So they were able to kind of show everybody, yes, it is possible to have decent crops using dry land farming techniques. And it was also because of the aridity of the American West that Congress amended the Homestead Act that you could homestead 320 acres, which is half a square mile. So the process began. Publicity, telling the people east of the Mississippi that you can become your own independent person. And I'd like to read this, and I'll paraphrase part of it. Are you tired of looking for work, tired of working for rented land, farming a few acres of high-priced land? Are you determined to be independent, to get a home of your own, to leave it to your family? Stop working in trades overcrowded. Stop running a business that barely pays expenses. Stop paying rent to land that you will never own. Go where you can work for yourself, where you can work all the time, where your children can get a good start in life. Buy a farm. Be a homesteader. And help the railroads. So they put out these posters everywhere, and we're just going to kind of scroll through them. These were plastered all over towns in the Midwest and the East. Head west, young man. Homestead. So the railroads, of course, were the lifeline because you had to have a railroad to export your produce. Hopefully, a homestead would not only be able to feed themselves, but to raise surplus food, and it had to be shipped by a railroad. So a lot of the homesteading towns sprang up along the 2 major routes east that ran from east to west, as well as 2 routes that made a crisscross through the middle of Montana and through the Golden Triangle. Interestingly, the railroads would allow a homesteader to rent a whole boxcar, and even some of them even rented several. You could put all of your furnishings. You could even bring your animals. Some of the homesteaders actually rode the trains with their animals in the car so that they could feed them and water them and keep them safe. So the the railroads made it very feasible for farmers to get all of their equipment and their animals from point A to point B. And as they developed, then mostly the dryland farming, a lot of wheat elevators developed. And this map shows how, look, it's just in a 3-year period. The red shows what lands were surveyed and open to homesteading, just in Montana over a 3-year period there. Now, this chart is kind of good news, bad news. It shows that a fairly large number of people were able, by state, to obtain the title to their land. But if you start reading the numbers, you realize that in every state there was less than half of all the people who tried. All the people who attempted to become the owner, half of them or more failed. And if you look at Montana, we're at 35%. That means twice as many homesteaders in Montana failed as attempted to be an owner of their land. And it goes all the way down to about 1 out of 7 down there in Alabama. And notice there's no restriction on it being a Western proposition. Anybody in any state could homestead land that the federal government had jurisdiction over. But of course, it's mostly in the Western states. Okay, so we're going to just kind of scroll through some pictures showing what a tough life. And when I see these pictures, I think how different it is from all of our lives today. Just a couple days ago, when I was looking at reviewing my slides, I noticed he had a pitchfork, and so you know what it reminded me of? Grant Wood's famous painting. Thought that was interesting. So compare all these homes to your homes, folks. And I think this is the dwelling right there. The rest are outbuildings. Isn't it hard to believe people were gambling their lives and their fortunes on such meager dwellings? And yet they had a lot of pride. It could have been an improvement from their lives. So many, literally millions of people attempted it. Notice the earth berming against the shack to try to keep the building warm. Can you imagine living in a 12 by 12 foot building, especially through a Montana winter?
They still had a dozen children, though.
Yeah.
You haven't explained that part.
Yeah. Now, not only, you notice the Homestead Act not only did not say you had to be a man, it didn't say anything about race. So after the Civil War, many African Americans headed west to try their luck at homesteading. And after 1898, people of Asian descent were allowed to homestead, but not prior to that. And here's a photograph I have. Some of these homestead shacks are just out in the middle of nowhere for nobody for miles and miles and miles. It's just incredible. And I found this interesting. The building on the right was probably the first one. And then maybe as they had kids or their relatives came, they built on an extra building and then even another one. Just to the right of this one was the fourth structure. And the man lived in there until the 1960s. The owner of this land and this property took me there because a lot of my photographs are on private land because most of the homesteading things are still on private land. With a few exceptions. But anyway, the fourth dwelling is off to the right, not pictured here. And the man died in the 1960s. and the owner still had the key, and he took me in there. Have you ever gone into a building that has basically been abandoned for almost 60 years? Because I did this just a few years ago. There was still things from the 1960s. It's just like they locked the doors and walked away and never changed anything. I mean, there was newspapers and magazines and clothing and furniture. Unfortunately, some of the windows had been broken and birds had gotten in, so it was turning into somewhat of a mess. But anyway, that's a sidebar. Here's a homestead shack that I hiked to. Somebody homesteaded up in the foothills of the Belt Mountains. And this homesteader was pretty smart. That's a windmill there. You don't, it's the vanes are gone, but it's not to draw water. It's actually to generate electricity. And this man built his own little generator in the basement. They even had kits. This is a curved roof homestead, and I was told by the locals that there were companies that created kits, you know, all the lumber for a homestead, and then ship it out by railroad, and then you assemble it. The IKEA concept. And they had curved roofs. They're really rare. That's the only one homestead I've ever seen with a curved roof. To farm your land, you may have to pick the rocks out of the field. And I found what one family did with their rocks. This is really a rarity. Somebody put all these rocks around the wooden frame. If you look in the right-hand corner there, I don't think my, yeah, there's the wooden frame. And the rocks help hold the temperature down in the summer so it's cool, and it helps keep the dwelling moderately warm in the winter. So it was actually a pretty neat idea to, you had to pick the rocks out of the field anyway, so put it around your house. And here's another idea, put tar paper or shingling type around your house, because I bet the wind would blow through some of these wooden shacks pretty well. Square Butte in the background. We used to live not too many miles from that. This is only a couple miles away from where we lived. All right, women homesteaders. There were a number of them that tried to be homesteaders, and they were permitted if they were single, divorced, or widowed, and I thought it was humorous, or if your husband was a drunkard. Can you imagine that, going to the land office or to the government officials, and the official had, yeah, we know your husband's no good. We'll give you a homestead attempt. So here's two women who homesteaded next to each other, and the section line ran right between them so that they could have property adjoining. I even found up in Choteau County, 3 relatives had homesteads within a few feet of each other where the section lines cross. So there's like 4 plots of land. 3 of them built shacks so they could all be within a few feet of each other. Unfortunately, 2 of the shacks had been torn down and moved away, so it was only 1, so I didn't take a picture of it. But there was actually 3 people who homesteaded right close to each other at the junction of the 4 corners of the homestead, of the plots. Well, women worked inside the home, obviously. That was always expected of them, but in the homesteading era, they often worked in the outside of the home. They were always expected to, prepare food, do a lot of canning. The husband might bring in extra food by shooting wild game, and it was her job to, prepare it, dry it, or can it. So you'll find a lot of pictures of women helping during the harvest, milking, and I thought this was interesting. There's actually 18 places in Montana where it was all women who homesteaded. No men on the deed. And here is, though, the statistic, women homesteaders were still fairly rare. This is 2 different counties, Custer County and Dawes County, Montana. It looks like maybe up maybe up to 5% of the homesteaders were women. Whoops, I'm sorry. I went too fast. Sorry about that. So one of the things that, okay, there we go, I'm sorry. I learned a lesson, don't hold the button down. Here's a couple of women who were very proud to be homesteaders that were able to prove up. And of course, a lot of women, if they couldn't be, if they were married, they couldn't file a claim with their husband, they often found employment as school teachers. There was a rule, once you got married, you couldn't be a school teacher anymore then. That lasted quite a bit longer than you would think. And you definitely couldn't be a pregnant mother in front of those children, for sure. So mechanization changed homesteading. Originally, most of the plowing was done by animals. And as they developed more sophisticated machinery, it became more efficient, from a single disc to up to 4 shovels. And we had mechanization of the early harvesting machinery. And here we have 16 mules pulling looks like maybe a cedar.
Lee, I have a question.
Yes.
What the things we're saying now involve proving up the property, and some agency person would come and check the homestead acres that
Right.
being bought by somebody back east and or on paper, but never used.
Well, that's part of the idea of fraud. You had to prove to the people in the land offices in those counties that you had actually lived there that long and that you were the one that did the actual.
The agent had to come out to the property.
Yes, generally so. I would think so. Whoops. This one, we had that picture of a large number of animals, and here's a really large barn that I photographed. It is really hard for me to understand. There are no streams anywhere, no shacks or anything. This is just out in the middle of thousands of acres of wheat. And the idea that they had to build a barn this big to house all the animals, where do they get their water? I don't know. But it's really amazing but you had to have, food and shelter and feed for your draft animals. I was also at a rancher's place, and he told me that he had a road grader. Well, it was all jammed in with a bunch of other machinery, and I couldn't photograph it. And I went off and photographed something else, and unbeknownst to me, he hooked his truck up and pulled it out into the field so I could photograph it. This is a horse-drawn road grader. Can you imagine plowing roads over the prairies to connect everybody so they could at least get to town to a railroad with a horse-drawn road grader? A man would stand in the back where those big wheels are, and with those big wheels, he was able to control the angle of the blade and the height of the blade, as well as the brakes and so on. I thought that was just amazing. And I still have found, I think, at least 3 different people who were proud to show me that they'd kept the horseshoes that their grandfather had started the homestead with almost 100 years prior. But as mechanization improved, the efficiency in the harvests went up. And as the 20th century evolved, horses gave way to machinery. My grandfather farmed land in central Illinois, and he was one of the last ones to give up using animals and buy a tractor. But anyway, and here's another example of a farm machinery that was likely drawn by a tractor. What kind of tractors did they have? Well, the first types were steam tractors. These were huge behemoth things that could really develop a lot of power, but you'd better know and understand your steam engine because they have a certain danger to them. Interestingly, there's still a lot of people that love to fix up their old steam engines, and they have these expositions where they all get together and have parades and admire each other's old steam engine tractor. And here's showing not only did the steam tractors pull things, but they also had power takeoffs so that you could run power from a steam engine to your thrashing machine. And I had the privilege of discovering a very, very old thrashing machine. This is what's called a Red River thrashing machine, and it's made out of wood, because most of you probably think of thrashing machines as made out of metal, and that's most of the kinds that I've been able to find. But here was one actually made out of wood in the 19-teens. He was really proud to still have that. And you can see the power takeoff wheels here that with belts that were connected to a tractor, most likely a steam tractor at that time. So most of the ones you see now are metal-sided. So during thrashing time, often you'd have a large crew come to help you. The neighbors would show up, or traveling workers would show up, and the woman would have to make a big feed, in the middle of the day for all these men. And I like this quote here. Nothing fancy, just good, well-cooked food and lots of it. And there was at least enough. And my mother baked bread that was fit for the gods. And she always remarked as she passed the platter that it, quote, it didn't quite raise right this time. Or that the mouth-watering coconut layered cake she was cutting, quote, had fallen just a little bit when one of the kids slammed the kitchen door. Yeah. But everybody knew that her bread and her cakes was wonderful. And she knew it too. Replacing steam tractors were the gasoline tractors. Apparently they were more efficient, a little bit cheaper, probably safer. And gasoline perhaps was easier to procure rather than wood or coal to run your steam tractors. And there's a lot of old trucks still around. A lot of these farmers, when they retire their equipment, they don't like to, sell it, or they just put it off somewhere. And so many of the ranchers and farmers that I got to know, they always had an iron pile. They just put their old equipment aside and let it sit there forever. So I was able to find a lot of these old trucks. All right, fraud. How do you prove, that you were always there? How do you prove that you actually did the cultivating? And according to this chart, 8.5% were rejected because of not being honest and claiming they were proving up. And here was another problem. The cattlemen got to the high plains before the homesteaders, and they would often entice their hired hands to file a homestead claim, especially on water, and then sell that claim back to the owner so that his cattle could always have access to a stream.
One thing I've noticed in some of the records of my family who homesteaded in Nevada Creek up in Helmville is that there were witnesses required when it wasn't just an agent going to check. There were actual witnesses. They were recorded. They were shown in paper who they were, and they would witness to the fact that the person had proved up.
All right.
I don't know what percentage went which way, or if that was just an alternative, but that was.
I wouldn't be surprised if that was more widespread. Paulette?
My family homesteaded in northeastern Montana, and the land offices were closer together then, and the agents didn't go out unless there was a problem, but they would take their neighbors with them as witnesses, and then they would be witnesses for their neighbors that, oh yeah, I see the lights on in the house all the time. Or, oh yeah, he's been out there working on that field, or he built this barn. And it's all written down in their documents what their neighbors said about them to prove that they were getting their homestead credit.
Right, that they had honestly done the requirements.
Because like now, land management is in one place in Billings. When it was homestead time, it was a land office about every 70 to 100 miles, depending where you were in Montana.
Right.
Because ours was in Glasgow, so it
All right.
wasn't very far away.
On the last slide, you had, it included marriage fraud. What does that mean? How do you, I thought it didn't matter if it's a head of the household.
I'm not sure what that phrase means. She wondered what this marriage fraud was. I'm not sure what that means. Maybe I could envision that maybe a woman claimed she wasn't married to somebody they had, so she could get 160 acres, and her husband could get 160 acres, but only one family could get the claim. That would be my hypothesis. So as the homesteaders went west, they were clashing up against the cattle outfits, and the cattlemen sometimes resorted to fence cutting because the homesteaders didn't want free-range cattle trampling down their fields, and the cattlemen sometimes fought back by cutting their fences. So there was a lot of ill feeling between the big cattle outfits and the homesteaders, and they had derogatory names for them like Hanyakkers. You know, I was here first, so this is my land, except they didn't own the land. They were taking advantage of the free range. Now, this was an interesting statistic. You might think that, well, once you prove up, you know, that's it, and, you know, they stay on the land. A large number of them were selling out not too long after they became the owner of the land. In other words, they stuck it out to become the owner, but within a few years, look at the numbers that you can see here in these charts, they began selling out. It was just probably too tough of a life, and it probably was because of, you know, the oncoming drought of the 30s. But there was a large number that, even though they got ownership, they didn't keep the land. They sold out to their neighbors and went somewhere else. It was just too tough of a proposition. And the land agents in the beginning probably, you know, just like the railroads, you know, promised them that, you know, they would make good on it and you'd have a live happily ever after. It just, the rosy pictures just didn't pan out. And let's look at some of the reasons why it was so tough to hold on, to become an owner through the Homestead Act and to hold on to your land. First of all, we had grasshopper infestations. I've got a quote here talking about when the grasshoppers came, they would mix grasshopper poison with sawdust and molasses, and they would spread this over the acreage each day, and the grasshoppers wouldn't eat their crop then, but then it would dry out, and they'd have to come back the next day and put it onto the fields. I mean, whoosh. So we don't think of the grasshopper infestations now. It's relatively uncommon because of pesticides and herbicides, but look at these infestations that we see on the maps from these years in Montana, and even from the Dakotas. So it was a much bigger problem before the invention of modern insecticides. Not only did you have to fight against insects, you had Mother Nature dumping hail. I don't know if you can understand this picture, but all of this light stuff is hail, probably the size of golf balls. And, you know, it's just ruined whatever that crop was. Here is a map showing all the people that suffered from a hailstorm and foreclosed on their land, had to give it up. In, let's see, Hill County, near Box Elder and Havre. Well, as I had mentioned before, the 19 teens and 20s were relatively high rainfall decades, but then came the 30s. Whoops. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we had some technical difficulties. I had a slide showing rainfall through the 20th century, and it obviously really dipped really low in the 30s, all of the 30s. And he was even pretty low in the early 1950s. But the 30s killed a lot of the homesteaders. They just couldn't manage it. And even in 1919, and I think I have a quote here, about in 1919. All year long, there was hardly any water, and it was really disastrous, even in 1919. So one of the ways of being guaranteed of water was to have a windmill to draw it up out of the ground. And so there were a lot of windmills. Sometimes you had too much water. If you were unfortunate enough to have homesteaded on a riparian zone, you ran the risk of being flooded out. For example, I have a quote here of somebody near, it doesn't say exactly where, but they had their homestead down on a river bottom, and the ice jammed. This is before we had control of the rivers with a lot of dams. The ice would jam up and then flood everything behind it. So a lot of the riparian zones would get flooded out. This one family lost everything, their alfalfa crop, several $1,000s. Part of their house was demolished. They lost all their furniture. So either not enough water or sometimes too much water. And here's a tragic story. This one says, I was just raking the last few forks full up to dead when a bolt of lightning came out of a small cloud above us and hit both of the horses right in the ears and killed them. We could not believe our eyes. Gray walked around to see if they were hurt, and they were both dead. Out of the sky comes a bolt of lightning and kills two of your animals. One way of surviving the Homestead era was to have jobs in the city or try to do trapping. Pardon me. Killing coyotes. We have no wheat, we have no oats, we have no barley to feed our shoats. We do not live, we simply stay. We're too damn poor to move away.
Lee, I have a question.
Yeah, yes.
When you had that high percent of people selling out after 1 year, would be the benefit of the contiguous owner to go from 300 to 600 acres,
Right.
and then 1,200.
Right.
There'd be just one owner, but
Right.
the decision of how many acres really, unlike eastern USA, what was the final decision? That it really took about 1,000 or 1,200 acres to
Well,
survive?
I can give you a modern answer to that. When I lived in Denton, Montana, in Fergus County from 1969 to 1974, I worked for several ranchers. And he told me that he cropped around 2,000 acres to make a living for a family. And I saw the man about 5 years ago. He's since deceased. And he says now it's up to around 4,000 acres of wheat land to make it profitable for one family. So it's always, we've had fewer and fewer people crop more and more land because of increased efficiencies of farming and because of the markets that, you just can't make a living for even for one family on less than a couple thousand acres of wheat land.
Well, a century earlier, something that even at 300 acres, that was sort of a wild ass guess that it was more than the east.
Right.
But they didn't know it would have been maybe
Yeah, I
3 times as much.
Because the laws were created for east of the Mississippi where the rainfall was so high. And, they did try to make provisions by raising it to 320, which wasn't still enough. And then they reduced the time frame from 5 years to 3 years. So they were trying to recalibrate it through amendments to the process, because they were realizing it was just too difficult in the high plains. But I can't give you an exact number, but we just know the trend that more and more of them had to sell out to the neighbors. So today's survivors are the people who have the land that was homesteaded maybe by 5 or 10 or 15 people.
Well, there's
Yes.
one word you haven't used, though, and that's irrigation. You have to really irrigate those 4,000 acres.
But not on the dry land. I was referring to like dry land farming for like wheat. That's what this rancher was referring to. Back here?
John Wesley Powell, and I don't know what year, but advocated for 2,520 acres said that's what it would take to make it.
2,500 acres.
4 sections.
Wow.
And it turns out that was a lot closer than 320.
Right.
And the other thing is a rule of thumb is a farm has to double in acres in every 20 years. And when you think about it, it's not difficult to go from 320 to 640, but once you get to 4,000, to go to 8,000 or 8 to 16, you're talking
Right.
a whole bunch of money.
And it gets more difficult. The rancher I worked for, who had 2,000 acres that he was cropping, these were not contiguous. He had me drive 5 miles that way and then 10 miles that way the next day. His land was all over the place, either that he owned or that he was on a 50-50 sharecropping basis. So quite often, you know, whoever bought the land, it wasn't contiguous, so that made it even more difficult. This is a picture of that large barn that I showed a number of slides ago, and I'm going to skip what I actually was going to say about that barn. I was told that one of the owners in this area hung himself there. Just couldn't face the idea that he had failed to provide for his family. So that was a very sad part. Schools, there were schools almost everywhere because the children either had to walk or ride an animal to the school. So practically, you know, every township had a school. That would be 36 square miles, 6 miles by 6 miles. And so a lot of the schools, though, obviously had to be abandoned as the people were selling out and the farms were increasing in size as a number of people.
Buildings behind a building like that?
Well, most likely,
Way to
yeah.
go?
Yeah, probably.
Well, you didn't take any pictures.
No, I didn't see any outhouses with the schoolhouses. One of the problems with the children was getting lost in this country. I won't go into the details here. I'm running close to almost an hour. But there are stories of children getting lost. In fact, in the Denton area, there was supposedly a child who got lost when a winter snowstorm appeared. You know, when a winter snowstorm shows up, depending on its severity, you can't go anywhere during it, and afterwards you have to make sure that you can, get to your animals, get to the barn. But in the Denton area, there supposedly was a child who died when they tried to go home from school and didn't make it because of a snowstorm. So you had a lot of fear that, this was hazardous times for your children. And here is an inscription on a sandstone that a rancher took and showed to me. And I would like to read or show you something. In spite of all of these hardships, and this is taken from a handwritten document by a homesteader, and he says, "Life would seem to moderns to be drab, hard, with little opportunity for recreation. Yet we who lived in these small towns," meaning in Montana, on the plains, "would have been astounded had we been told that life was not interesting, stimulating, or worthwhile." That they were always able to find meaningful life. Now I'll put this over on the table. This reminds me then, I brought about half of my homesteading books. A number of these pictures I've taken from some of the books. So afterwards, come over and look at these, and feel free to write down the titles if you'd like to either check some out from the library or buy them on the used book market. But we look back and realize how difficult it was. Here's a story that I found in one of the books that I was reading. This is down on the Missouri River breaks. A wagon tipped over and he was cut severely on his leg by the scythe. His dad took a chew of tobacco from his mouth and applied it to the wound, and this procedure was repeated the next day. When Dr. Hodges showed up about 3 days after the accident, he checked the injury and then told Mr. Simpkins, "I couldn't have done a better job myself." So I guess if you cut yourself, spit some tobacco chew into it. If you don't have a doctor, do something. This is the Rattlesnake Barn. I called this log barn and rattlesnakes because about the time I was taking this picture, I heard a rattlesnake rattle in the high grass. And the rattlesnake went that way and I went that way. And about 10 minutes later, this rattlesnake bit the dog of the people I was with. It only cost him a vet charge of $1,100. But anyway, I'd like to read a little quote about the barns that people had. He said, if someone built a new barn, there would be a barn dance as soon as it was finished. Someone usually played a violin or an organ for music. The kids were put to bed on benches around the walls, and the grown-ups danced all night. Homesteading today. If you'd like to see a homestead on public property, when you float the Missouri River, you can stop at the Hagedorn Homestead. It's on BLM land, it's public, and that's his shack in the back, and he's got a lot of machinery around. And here's the sign that they have there. And I found it interesting that Mr. Hagedorn's wife left him. There were too many rattlesnakes around when you have little children out playing, and it just scared her to death, and she packed up and took the kids and went elsewhere. And here's a homestead founded by a woman. She lived on it till the age of 93, and it's now on the National Register of Historic Places. And my wife Nancy and I stopped at the Homestead National Monument in Beatrice, Nebraska. It's devoted to the whole concept of what you're seeing here, with a lot of really neat artifacts. And if you like to read one book, I think, that tells the homesteading story the best as far as its tribulations and what it's like, it's by a man that I knew, John Martin Campbell. He's since deceased, but it's called A Magnificent Failure, a portrait of Western Homestead Era. He went all over the West taking pictures. I've pretty much restricted myself to Montana. There's plenty of homesteads to photograph. And here is a learned or a scholarly book on homesteading on the plains. I have both of these books over here on the table. So I think I would like to close by reading. I need some light here. I want to read the very last quote from you so that put things in a little bit of a perspective. And this is from a Montanan. He said, I have never been sorry that I grew up there, meaning I believe this was in Valentine, Montana, and that was in the early 1900s. He said it was a great country, for kids especially. We had our chores and responsibilities, but also lots of free time to ride our horses anywhere we chose, explore many interesting places, swim, ski, skate, and have fun just being together. We had a happy life in spite of a scarcity of material possessions and money. Equally important were the people in the community. There was no place where one could find a finer, more unselfish class of people than the homesteaders. I thought I'd leave you with a positive note like that. And I'll take, say, maybe 5 minutes or so for questions, and then you can come up and talk to me individually. So a few questions, lady in the back.
Say about ranchers, there are homesteaders in this area that were ranchers. They may have raised a little bit of wheat or something, but mostly alfalfa, I would think. I don't know if you've got anything that you know about this area.
The photographs in my collection that are related to ranchers are down on the Missouri River. There were a lot of homesteading cattle ranchers along the Missouri River, and so that's what I photographed on one of my seasons.
Buildings out in Frenchtown, up Pool Creek, looking to the west, you might see some old the Boyer Ranch.
Okay, because obviously it wasn't restricted to just people who were raising crops. It was for anybody that could make a living by any means off the land.
I know when my great-grandfather homesteaded in 1867 in the Nevada Creek Valley, his original crop was horses, not cattle.
Oh, really?
Because back then that's all they had was horses to pull
Right.
everything. And he had over 1,000 horses at one.
So we must have had access to a lot of haylands then? River bottom.
Yeah, it's beautiful land. And just as an aside, I had somebody do some research in Germany, and his father was a master saddle maker in Germany.
Oh, okay. Familiar with them. Yeah. One last question, Jim.
As a botanist, I've been in every county in western Montana since 1960, and the thing that caught my eye were not only these buildings that were half falling down, but the trees and the bushes around them. And you talk about the homesteader's wife visiting, having to deal with a home that was sitting in nowhere, and so they got trees. And I have an instrument called Inkman core, and I could find out that the home had a tree planted in it a century before, if not 120 years earlier. Kind of interesting. And then the one topic that he did not touch on are the traveling salesmen who sold lilacs. You ever see a lilac that's almost as big as a...
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop.
Well, thank you very much. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to come up and see me and come up and look at the books that I brought. There's a lot of literature. I've got like 30 books in my library about it, so thank you very much.